Dear friends, colleagues, we are delighted to have Professor Clemens Fuest, born in 1968, is president of the 6th IFO Institute, Leibniz Institute for Economic Research at the University of Munich, director of CESIFO, professor of economics at the University of Munich, and director of the Center for Economic Studies at the University of Munich. He has served the International Institute of Public Finance in various positions and is currently the president of the association for the period from 2018 to 2021. And as you know, many of you have been participating in IIPF conference in various parts of the world. And Dr. Lekha Chakraborty is also a member of the IIPF board currently. So IIPF is known to our faculty also in India, very popular. Professor Fuest has been a member of the Academic Advisory Board of the German Federal Ministry of Finance since 2003, and he's also a member of the European Academy of Science and Arts and of the German National Academy of Science and Engineering. His research areas are economics and fiscal policy, international taxation, and European integration. Dr. Fuest is going to talk about the corona pandemic and its impact on public finance. And I'll briefly introduce the lecture to you before I hand it over to Professor Fuest. The corona pandemic caused a global economic crisis. Many countries suffered severe economic consequences, and they had to support the economy with fiscal policies. Public finances of many countries came under pressure, as Professor Fuest says, and as we have seen in our own country, debt levels increased substantially. Clemens Fuest will present the impact of the crisis on the economy and on the public finance in the world. He will also discuss political options of governments for a sustainable development of public finances in the aftermath of the crisis. Professor Fuest, over to you. Thank you very much for joining us for this very important event, for this keynote address. Thank you. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Professor Chakraborty. Good afternoon to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted about the fact that IIPF has a presence at this conference. And I'm very much looking forward to exchanging views with you about the situation of fiscal policy, the general economic situation. We are all in this crisis. Now, I will use a few slides and I will try to share them. Let me see if we get that going. Okay, so you should be able to see the slides now, I hope.
Yes, it's visible.
Great. Okay, so here is what I would like to talk about. First of all, a few words about where we are with this pandemic. It is not over, and India is one country, but there are many others particularly affected by recent developments. And of course, that the state of the pandemic is important for the economic implications, for many things, for health primarily, but for the economic impact, of course. So where are we? Then the worldwide economic impact of the crisis and the state of the recovery. And then I will talk about the impact on public finances, and as Professor Chakraborty just said, primarily on the impact about the impact on public debt. And that takes me to the issue of fiscal policy after the pandemic. So how should we design fiscal policy after the pandemic, and in particular tax policy? And I would then like to conclude raising a few issues about what needs to be done and where the focus of tax policy should be if we intend to grow out of the debt rather than having to cut spending and increase taxes massively to get out of it. Okay, now let's take a very brief look at the current state of the pandemic. What we see here is COVID-19 deaths, registered COVID-19 deaths by regions, and this is going in waves. It affects the entire world. Very recently, of course, India, as you know much better than I do. There are some areas of the world where COVID deaths are declining at the moment, but there's always a danger of new waves. So here we see a map of daily new confirmed death on the 27th of June. And we see India very affected, but also Brazil, Russia, and several other countries. So the crisis is far from over, although infections have fallen in some parts of the world. The way out of the pandemic is, of course, to a large extent, vaccination. Now, some countries have made advances, have made progress in vaccinations. Israel, as you know, the United Kingdom and the United States were first to roll out the vaccines. Europe was lagging behind, but has now caught up. But then there are regions of the world where there is much less progress, including India, Latin America. And as you see, the world average is around 20%, which is far from what's necessary to control this pandemic and get to what we call herd immunity. So all of this suggests the pandemic is unfortunately not over. On the other hand, there is some progress with the vaccines, and there is a hope that there will be further improvements getting this pandemic under control as the vaccines are rolled out. So 23% we have currently of world population vaccinated. Now, what was the worldwide impact and how far are we with the recovery? Now, there has been a lot of debate about what this crisis is compared to other crises. And there are, in the last 100 years, there are basically two economic crises that are comparable: the global financial crisis from 10 years ago and the Great Recession in the 1930s. And whatever metric one takes, what one usually finds if comparing these crises is that the Great Depression in the 1930s in the countries most affected by this depression was a lot worse than what we've seen in the corona pandemic so far. Fortunately, the impact of the corona pandemic wasn't as bad, but the impact of the corona crisis is worse than the global financial crisis. So in terms of historic comparison, this crisis and its impact on economic output, employment, and so on is somewhere between the financial crisis, the impact of the financial crisis, and the Great Depression, but it's fortunately closer to the financial crisis. How can we calculate the economic loss caused by the crisis? There are different ways. Now, what I've done here is compare a scenario without the crisis. So for that, I take the latest forecasts before the crisis, the IMF forecast from the autumn 2019, as a scenario without crisis, and I compare this to the current forecasts. And what we see here is that we have a wide range of losses. This is the accumulated crisis-related GDP loss in 2020 and 2021. And in this group of countries we have here, there are huge differences, and I find the largest impact for India, indeed. You know this much better than I do, but on average in 2020 and 2021, without the crisis, GDP would have been 13 percentage points higher than it actually was or is forecasted to be in India. In Europe, there are large losses in the United Kingdom. For instance, the United Kingdom has minus 20%, so has lost 10% of GDP per year during the crisis. Germany 5%, and other countries, China or the United States, between 2 and 3. So the impact has been very significant and very different across countries. Of course, this is partly related based on forecasts, scenarios, but still the losses are significant. This is what this suggests. Now, how are we getting out of this crisis? How are we progressing? And what is the expectation about how we will get out of this crisis? On the left-hand side here, you see the scenario for world GDP and for the European Union and the United States without the crisis. So how would they have grown without the crisis? So the world economy grows more quickly than the mature economies in the United States and in the European Union. And you see that here on the left-hand side. The gray dotted line is above the two other lines. That is the hypothetical growth forecasted, the expected growth forecasted at the end of 2019. And how have things then developed? This is the gray line is the gray solid line is world GDP as it developed and as it is forecasted to develop in the coming years, as it is forecasted now. And you see there was the dip, there was the reduction in output in 2020 when the pandemic broke out, and now the recovery. And the world economy is, it seems, now moving on a slower growth path, but it is coming back to growth. Now, how about Europe and the United States? Here you see the current forecasts for the EU. And what you see here is it will last. Maybe the EU will never reach its old growth path, a bit like the world economy, but it's clearly below the dotted line. The blue line here is clearly below the dotted line. So the European Union will struggle to reach the old growth path or may never reach it. It is recovering, yes, but it takes time. You see that the EU will reach the pre-crisis level at the end of 2021, beginning of 2022, under current forecasts, but it will not reach the old growth path. This is different for the United States. The red line here shows you that, yes, there was also, of course, a decline in GDP in the United States, but in 2021, what we expect is a swift recovery, a stronger recovery than in Europe, and this is related to two things: the strong fiscal expansion in the United States and the earlier progress with the vaccines. Because the vaccines were rolled out a lot more quickly than in Europe, it was possible to open up the economy earlier, and that has helped the United States. And if these forecasts are correct, the United States will reach its old growth path. So this is a difference to the EU. Now let's look at India and China. India and China are both countries growing much more quickly than the world average, as you see on the right-hand side here. The orange line for India and the red line for China. This was the expected growth, the growth that was expected before the COVID crisis. Now, we've seen the line for the world economy, and China will reach its old growth level, its pre-crisis growth path this year. So it will return to the old growth path almost this year, and this will continue. So like the US, China has a good growth story or a good recovery story, strong recovery story. Current predictions are different for India. These are IMF forecasts. I'm sure you know a lot more about forecasts for India than I do, but what this suggests is that India will struggle a lot to get close to the pre-crisis growth path. It is significantly below this growth path, almost 10 percentage points. Of course, if an economy growing as quickly as the Indian economy misses a year and even shrinks, it is difficult to catch up and make that good. That's more difficult than for a developed or a high-income country that has much lower growth rates. Okay, so that's where the recovery is. It is underway, but very differently across the globe. Now, what does that mean for the distribution of weights in the global economy? We are all aware that weights in the global economy are shifting and have been shifting for a long time towards Asia, towards India, towards China. And what does it do to that development? So what we see here is the long run trend in changes in the global economy, this shift of weight. So what we see here is relatively shares in global GDP. This is data in purchasing power parities. And what we see here is essentially, yes, declining weight, of course, of the EU, including UK, a declining weight of the United States and of other developed countries. Here, for instance, a declining weight of Japan. Of course, China is rising, and as I'm sure you know, China, which was only less than 5% of global GDP in the early 1990s, has now overtaken the EU and the United States, is now the biggest economy on the globe in terms of GDP measured in purchasing power parities. India has also been catching up, but much slower. And in the crisis, while China has accelerated in the growth of its share in the global economy, India has had bigger problems, and its share in the global economy has declined a little. It will continue to grow afterwards, according to current forecasts. But you see here the shift in weights, at least towards China, is accelerated, but not the shift to Asia, including India. Yes, you see this, if you look at the numbers, you see this here. So this is the change in percentage points in relative shares in global GDP, and China has increased, Europe has lost ground, and India has also lost ground. Europe has lost more than India. But this is the impact of the pandemic here we see. Okay, now what is the impact of all of this on public finances? Of course, governments have responded to the crisis, and rightly so, by providing liquidity to the private sector, to households, to companies. And this has increased public debt ratios. And this is normal in a crisis. What you see here is the development of public debt ratios since the mid-90s. And what's striking here, and that is a development which is well known, is that public debt ratios seem to be ever increasing. India is an exception, in fact, and but there are a few exceptions. In most countries, there is a trend beyond crisis, so there is a long-term trend towards ever higher public debt ratios, and that trend has, of course, been accelerated in the crisis and as a result of the Corona crisis. And Europe here is no exception. In Europe as well, we have growing debt ratios. We have had that for a long time, and countries in Europe struggle to bring down debt ratios in good times. They always increase in bad times, but countries have trouble bringing them down in good times. So the question is, do these debt ratios only have one direction, and do we in each crisis increase them without reducing them again? I guess that's a major concern in fiscal policies of our time. Now, how can you calculate the impact of the crisis on the debt ratios? Again, you can compare scenarios without the crisis based on forecasts and scenarios with the crisis. And what you see here is an increase in the debt ratio, yes, of typically something like 20% of GDP. And this applies to countries like Japan or the UK, the G7, and it also applies to India in these calculations. Greece is an outlier. In China, not much has happened, and so most countries are somewhere in the range between 15 and 25% of GDP, which is quite a lot. It's just a one-time increase in debt that will keep us busy in the years to come. Okay, now what does this mean for fiscal policy after the pandemic? Now, if we can agree that debt to GDP ratios cannot and should not increase permanently, but need to be stabilized at some point, the question is, how can they be stabilized? And from a theoretical perspective, there is a number of options here. Number one is growing out. So the debt ratio decreases because GDP grows faster than the debt. So one could just do nothing special about the debt, just leave it where it is and rely on GDP growing faster than the debt. Of course, that requires GDP to grow, and it also requires fiscal policy to not increase debt by too much, but that is one option. The other option is to engage actively in fiscal consolidation, either by raising taxes, increasing taxes, or by cutting spending, and I will come back to both of those options. There is, of course, the option of sovereign default, restructuring of government debt. That is, as we're all aware, full of risks. It has happened many times. It has happened in the Eurozone, in the case of Greece, and it has happened elsewhere many times. But sovereign defaults have their risks if we take into account their impact on the financial sector and on the credibility on future borrowing costs of countries and so on. We are all aware of that. It's certainly not an option one would start with. Of course, there is the option of trying to monetize public debt, to inflate it away, to engage in money printing. A lot of people are discussing whether that's what happening in some countries, at least at the moment. Now, monetization of public debt has its problems, of course. The feasibility depends on, among other things, on the maturity structure, and inflation has very high costs. So it's not clear to what extent that will play a role. And then there is finally the option of financial repression. So designing financial market regulation so that savers, insurers, pension funds are forced to hold government bonds with very low or negative real interest rates. And that's certainly what we currently observe in countries like Japan, many European countries in the Eurozone, and to a lesser extent also in the US, is indeed that government bonds have negative real interest rates, and regulation forces financial institutions to hold those government bonds. So that's yet another way of trying to reduce the public debt. Of course, that also has its cost. Now, let's talk a little bit about growing out of the debt. So how will the debt ratios develop? And that very much depends on how debt ratios were developing before the crisis. And one example is Germany, which I cite here, not because that's where I live, but because Germany is a case that shows that the dynamic before the crisis is important. So in Germany, the debt ratio had a falling trend. It was the result of a number of factors: relatively good economic growth, declining unemployment, declining interest rates. That has made it very easy to pursue a policy of balanced budgets before the crisis. As you're all aware, Germany has been criticized for its balanced budget policy. A lot of people have said fiscal policy in Germany should have been more expansionary before the crisis. The idea was that this would stimulate economic growth in other countries, but now with the experience of the crisis, it is quite clear that Germany was in a good position due to its balanced budget before the crisis. And what we see here is the blue line is the expected development of the debt ratio before the crisis, so in the autumn of 2019. So it was, at the time, it was at 60%. It expected to fall to 45% until 2024. The red line is what we expect now. So the public debt ratio in Germany, as a result of the crisis, will increase to 70%, maybe a little bit above. This is the IMF forecast, but then it will stabilize. And as things get back to normal, the debt ratio will start falling again. And very little to achieve that, very little is needed in terms of active consolidation policies. Just because there was a structural surplus before the crisis, not just balanced budgets, but even a small surplus, it will be relatively easy for Germany to get back to a declining, to stabilize its debt ratio and get it decline. Now, what are the assumptions underlying this scenario? What we see here is the development of the budget deficit, the red line, so planned budget deficit or expected budget deficit before the crisis, and in red the real budget deficit. And the expectation in this IMF forecast was that the budget would be large, yes, in 2021, but then it would return to almost zero in 2022. Current planning for the budget is different. Current planning suggests that the deficit will be higher in 2022. But still, to get the debt ratio, to stabilize the debt ratio and bring it down, we need a reduction of government deficits. How can that be brought about? Now, here is the assumption regarding spending and taxes. And the assumption here is that the deficit will decline just because spending declines by a significant extent between 2021 and 2022, almost 6% of GDP, 5% of GDP. And how can that come about? The idea is that the support granted to workers on short-term work schemes, companies, liquidity help to companies, restaurants, hotels, travel companies that have been shut down. The idea is that this help will no longer be needed. And what you see here is that the tax ratio, so the share of tax revenue in GDP, is expected to be more or less constant. So no tax increases and spending reduction mainly through the end of support, special crisis support for the government. That's the idea. And that will reduce public spending and take us back to balanced budget. That's the assumption underlying this scenario, but I would say it's not totally unrealistic. It will probably not exactly work like that. This is probably too optimistic regarding deficits, but that's the underlying idea. So it's, at least in the case of Germany, it's not totally unrealistic that the country can indeed grow out of the debt. But what's key here is the fiscal position before the crisis. How about other countries? So this is the data the IMF suggests for India. Again, you know much better how realistic this scenario is. So in the case of India, we also had a situation of declining debt ratios, not declining as quickly as in some other countries, but at least not increasing. So there was a declining debt dynamic, and the IMF expects that India will get back to this after the crisis, after the increase. It will be a slow reduction of the debt ratio, but it will get back to that. China is a different case. Now, as we all know, in China, the separation between the private and the public sector is less clear. So let's maybe not dwell too much on that. Here is the expected public debt ratio for the United States. And what we see here is a significant increase in public debt and the expectation that this will stabilize in the coming years. Now, with the current fiscal policy plans, it's unlikely that the debt ratio will be stabilizing so quickly. But here we see the US as a country with where the debt ratio was increasing before the crisis. And that makes it much more difficult to stabilize it after the crisis. So here the underlying assumptions on deficit reductions are relatively harsh, and I don't think that the current administration intends to implement that. Similar situation in Italy. So in Italy, the debt to GDP ratio was almost stable, but it wasn't declining, and it was at a very high level. And so 130% of GDP, it's now going to between 150 and 160, and it'll probably stay at these very high levels. So the IMF doesn't expect it will be brought down, and that may become a problem. In particular, if we think about the next crisis, which will come at some point. Okay, now how bad are these elevated debt levels? We have, and you're all aware of that, we have the debate about low interest rates and the relationship between growth and interest rates. And some people say, Olivier Blanchard is one, but there are more economists saying, okay, we need to reevaluate public debt because in times of low interests and in times where the growth rate exceeds the interest rates, public debt is not so bad. Now, indeed, interest rates on public debt have been declining for a long time now, since 2 decades, and that happened almost everywhere. There was a little spike in between in the global financial crisis, but generally interest rates have been declining. And of course, it makes a huge difference whether the interest rate on public debt is 5% or 1%, in particular if the rates of growth are similar and the growth rates have maybe declined a little. But not as much. So the difference between the interest rates and the growth rate has declined, and that has implications for public debt dynamics. So for the development of the debt ratio, if the interest rate is lower than the GDP growth rate, it is possible to have permanent primary deficits without increasing the debt ratio. So in one way of looking at this is to say, okay, it's a lot easier to stabilize debt ratios, so we can have higher deficits. We can have higher debt levels and higher deficits because it's easier to stabilize the debt ratio. You don't need primary surpluses, and maybe you can even work with primary deficits. So this has led to a widespread call to allow more public debt and to soften, for instance, national and European regulatory debt limits, fiscal rules. Some people also say, and rightly so, that if interest rates are lower, this may justify more public investment, or this is likely to justify more public investment because projects that were perhaps not productive enough now become worthwhile. Now, this is all fine. I mean, this is a simple mathematical fact. It is easier to reduce or stabilize the public debt ratio if the difference between interest rates and the growth rate is smaller. But the question is, I mean, given that we have 2 decades of declining interest rates, at least 2 decades, and a declining difference between interest rates and growth behind us, has this helped to reduce debt levels? Have countries really reduced their debt levels? And what you see here is that this is not the case. The opposite is the case. What you see in this graph is the blue columns are the difference between interest in public debt and GDP growth in basis points. So in the last 20 years, the average difference in the euro area was just 20 basis points. So there was almost no difference. And in some countries, this difference was even negative. In Spain and in particular in the US. The interest rate on government debt was in the US was 70 basis points lower than the growth rates. So it was easy in Spain, in particular in Spain and the US, it was easy to stabilize the debt ratio, but the government has done no such thing. You know, it has become easier, but the governments in these countries have reacted by increasing the debt ratio, not by reducing it. And they've been increased by 40 percentage points in Spain, by even more in the United States, and France has a similar situation. Even Germany, which sometimes praises itself for being particularly conservative, or which is sometimes criticized also for that, has had very favorable financing conditions, but hasn't reduced the debt ratio. So the idea that countries will use this very favorable situation to reduce their debt ratio, at least if we look at the last 2 decades, it hasn't happened. So, and that suggests maybe countries will react by further increasing their debt ratios, and that's a problem, in particular if we think that we need to bring down that ratio before the next crisis hits, and it will come at some point. Okay, now what can be done about this? One is to look at spending and to review public spending. What we see here is the development of public spending between 2019 and 2021. No surprise here, as a result of the crisis, many countries, practically all countries, have increased their public spending. The expectation is this will be reduced in 2021 and the years to come, but it's a slow process. So it may be necessary not just to rely on spending declining as support for the economy is reduced, but maybe to take a closer look whether we really need all the spending we have here. Now, there is another rather fundamental trend in many countries working towards higher public spending, not lower public spending, and that is the aging of the population. What you see here is from a report in 2019, sustainability gaps and age-related public spending. And in many countries, all countries here apart from France, as you see, what's expected is that age-related spending on pensions, on health will increase in these European countries here. I will come to the Indian situation in a moment. And that suggests that anyway, there will be pressures anyway to expand public spending. So it's all the more necessary to think about reviewing other types of spending that may be limited. Now that's a worldwide issue. What you see here is the old age dependency ratio, and as we all know, Europe is aging quickly. Canada, the United States, Russia, Australia are aging quickly. India is among the younger countries, of course. China is aging, and Japan is maybe the most extreme case. What we see here in this graph is that this graph compares the median age worldwide in countries in 2020 with the expected median age in 2050. And what we see is that the world is aging. This is also well known. So the aging process will spread to other countries. It will not be limited to the, let's say, to Europe and the United States. So to the West, it's going to increase in the years to come. What does that mean? As I mentioned, Japan is the country which is most advanced in terms of aging. And what we see here is the development of the dependency ratio between 1960 and 2017. And what we see here in the 1960s, Japan had a lot of high dependency ratio about young people. Young people depend on their parents, and very little dependency of old people. And this has been completely reversed. Today in Japan, the number, the old age dependency ratio is a lot larger than the young dependency ratio. And fiscally, of course, old age dependency is the big issue. The Indian situation here is different. India is has a young population, as you know, much better than I do. And what you see here is that dependency ratio of the young has declined, but the dependency ratio of the old has remained more or less constant. Now, how is this going to develop in the future? According to the United Nations projections, so what you see here is the working age population and the population of the elderly, the population share of the elderly and the young. And in Japan, the aging process will continue. So what you see here is a dramatic decline of the red part of the working population and working age population, and a growing share of the elderly. And even India on the right-hand side, completely different situation, of course, but even in India, at some point, the working age population will peak. But this is far from now, and this is probably not a major concern now. And I guess that's a difference between countries like India with a very young population and the European countries and the US, and of course Japan, which face this underlying pressure towards higher public spending through the aging process itself. Okay, now that's the spending side. How about the taxes? Do we need higher taxes to pay for the COVID debt? Now, I would like to start with a slightly more general question, and a question also, I believe, related to research, current research or research we need in this area. So what we have here as a result of the crisis is something like an exogenous increase in revenue requirements. You know, we've seen an increase in public debt of 20 percentage points, and you could say, okay, it's like a sudden increase in revenue requirements. So we need more tax money if we think we cannot grow out of it. The question is, how should we adjust tax structures? And what does tax theory say about how tax structures should be adjusted to such a situation? So one question is, how should we change, or should we change, the progressivity of the tax system? So if you look at current publications by the IMF and the OECD, of course, they would write the burden of the pandemic needs to be distributed fairly. So the rich should bear a larger part of the burden than the poor, and so on. And that's in some ways self-evident. But the question is, how about the optimal tax progression? Does it decline if revenue needs increase, or does it increase? And the standard optimal income tax model says, maybe perhaps surprisingly, optimal tax progression declines if revenue needs increase. Why does that happen? So to understand the intuition is an extreme example, but I think it helps to understand what's going here. Assume you have an economy with only two types of people, the poor and the rich. And the government, even before revenue requirements increase, the government is only interested in the poor and maximizes the well-being, the utility of the poor. So the political weight of the rich is zero. In that case, what's the optimal income tax? The optimal income tax will choose the top of the Lekha curve when it comes to the taxation of the rich. And this money is paid out to the poor. Now assume there is suddenly an exogenous requirement for revenue. So we need revenue for other things. Do we increase the degree of tax progression? No, because we are already at the top of the Lekha curve. So we cannot extract more tax revenue from the rich. That's why we will extract it all from the poor. So in this simple, of course, it's an extremely stylized model, but in this model, 100% of the additional tax burden is put on the poor, and that is in the interest of the poor. This is an extreme example, but it provides intuition for the insight that if you look at the standard model of optimal income taxation in a less extreme framework, what you find, a surprisingly robust finding, is that the optimal tax progression declines. And that's not very comfortable in terms of policy messages, but there is a conflict. The background is that there is a conflict of objectives. There is a trade-off between redistribution and generating a lot of revenue with the tax system. These are competing objectives. It doesn't get easier if you make the tax system more progressive. It doesn't get easier to raise revenue. How about other objectives of tax policy, revenue requirements, and environmental taxes? So here it's similar. The optimal, in a second best environment, the optimal differentiation, which aims at internalizing externalities, declines if you need more revenue for other things. Okay, then you readjust your revenue structure away from, let's say, protecting the environment, which is, like a bit like a public good competing with this other public good you are financing. So it becomes more difficult to use the tax system to internalize externalities. I think things are different with regard to international tax competition. So countries will be more reluctant, I believe, to reduce, at least again, that's what the standard model suggests, will be more reluctant to cut taxes to attract capital from abroad, for instance. Okay, now in terms of tax policy options, what are the options out there? One can, as I just discussed, you can increase income taxes. Of course, then you have the growth trade-off. The income tax undermines incentives to work and perform and so on. So this may damage growth. Of course, sales or value-added taxes also have a cost in terms of growth. They also reduce incentives to supply labor, but less so. And the evidence seems to suggest that the cost in terms of growth is lower, but the distributive cost is higher because they are regressive. Environmental taxes, okay. The trouble with environmental taxes is that, CO2 prices being one example, is that revenues tend to decrease over time if you increase those taxes. That's what's intended. And the revenue may also be needed to compensate losers in a transitional period. And now, finally, one tax that is discussed in the US quite intensively and in some European countries, including Germany as well, is to introduce a net wealth tax. Now here, the difficulty is, now that's a sort of the most extreme way of saying we want to make the very rich pay for this higher tax burden. But the trouble is, again, that if you do that, the combination of income and wealth tax can lead to very high overall tax burdens. And it would be a signal to investors to avoid investments in the country. This depends on how it is designed, but there is this issue. Now, let me say a few words about this net wealth tax idea. So should we make the rich pay for the COVID debt, despite what I just said about tax progression? What are the problems of introducing net wealth taxes? Now, first of all, what you get is a high effective burden on investment through the combination of income taxes and wealth taxes. Very simple example, in times of low interest rates, a typical return, let's say in the US or Europe, on real estate investment could be 3%. For instance, if you invest in rental housing, if you have a 1% wealth tax and a standard income tax, maybe 45% marginal rate, you get an overall marginal effective burden on income amounting to 78%. So it's not really worth doing the investment in this situation. Introducing net wealth taxes requires a strong intrusion into privacy. You have to check, what are the things of value people have at home? Do they hoard gold or whatever? So you need a lot of intrusion. And because it's a new tax, it has a very high salience. And many people would take the introduction of such a tax as a signal for capital flight, and entrepreneurs, wealthy people would leave countries. That's why it's not very attractive. Now, high wealth is mainly, wealthy people are wealthy because they mostly own business assets, and the higher tax burden would, of course, have an impact on business investment and jobs businesses provides. Now, many existing wealth taxes or wealth taxes that existed in the past exempt business assets to avoid the negative impact. That does work, but then the question of fairness arises. So if the most wealthy people are businessmen and if they own business assets and they are exempted from the tax, the question is who pays the wealth tax then? It is then more people with medium levels of wealth, maybe. And the question is whether it is fair to let the most wealthy individuals get away without paying the tax by exempting business income. So it's a difficult policy option. Let's take a look at what countries actually do. What we see here is the share of property-related taxes, not just net wealth taxes, but all taxes related to property. I will talk about them a little bit. And there are quite some differences in the extent to which countries have these taxes. Some here, like the Czech Republic or others, have property-related taxes at very low levels, 0.5% of GDP, and in other countries, United Kingdom, they are a lot higher, or France, 4% of GDP. So what is behind that variation? So it's mostly taxes on immovable property, so taxes on real estate. And that's easier because real estate cannot run away. It's also taxes on financial transactions or on real estate transactions. They are the most important, as you see in this graph, and very few countries still have net wealth taxes, so they are the exception. So if you try to benchmark your country against other countries, you can look at these property-related taxes, but you should bear in mind that property-related taxes are mostly taxes on immovable property, and net wealth taxes hardly exist. In fact, many countries have abolished net wealth taxes in recent years. Here's a list of countries that have done so. List of European countries. Other countries like the UK and the US didn't have net wealth taxes in the first place. So it's a tax that has been abolished increasingly in recent years. and it's it would be a turn, and I think in particular for countries acting individually, a problematic turn to reintroduce the net wealth tax as a reaction to this crisis. Okay, so final point, growing out of the debt, what should we look at? So my view is what we need in the years to come is a tax policy which is favorable for economic growth. And I think we should focus on two things here. First of all, obviously, economic growth is driven by investment. Investment and innovation. And in the debate about investment, public investment plays a large role. I think this is justified to some extent because public investment is important, but private investment is much more important. What you see here is, for instance, the case of Germany, private and public investment. And private investment is roughly eight times public investment. And it is clear that the economic future of Germany and most other countries depends primarily on the development of private investment. To some extent, private investment, or in some cases, private investment is supported by public investment, enabled. And that's why that's one reason why we need more public investment, but we, it would be risky to pursue a policy, as some people suggest, that makes private investment a lot less attractive, for instance, by introducing net investment taxes and relying on public investment to drive economic growth. It just doesn't work. You can see that here. Now, the other factor driving growth is, of course, employment and labor supply. And as we just discussed especially in the aging societies, the working population will shrink, and that's a challenge. And the tax system needs to set the right incentives to work. An extreme case here is Japan. So it's very difficult, if you see the development of the working age population, it's very difficult for Japan to grow in a world where in a situation where the population, the working age population, is shrinking so quickly. Again, India is favored because the expansion of the working age population will continue for some time and make it, drive economic growth. And that's why we have this expectation of much higher growth rates. And that's why it's also easier for India to deal with the debt. Let me conclude. The COVID crisis has brought us huge losses in economic output and an increase in public debt. Low interest rates allow for higher debt levels and allow us to, let's say, take time when reducing these debt levels, but we shouldn't rely on debt levels falling by themselves. We've seen in the last 2 decades that this hasn't really worked, and the next crisis will come. That's why I think tax policy should focus on economic growth as a primary way of bringing down the debt ratio. But to achieve that, we need favorable fiscal policy and tax policies for employment and investment. Thank you. Stop here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Clemens Fuest, for such a fascinating lecture. I will now request the participants to either write in the chat box or to directly ask questions. If you could raise hand and then can unmute and yourself and can ask the questions.
Pinaki.
Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Thank you so much, Professor Fuest, for such an excellent lecture. My question relates to your point on public debt in the low interest rate regime. And you mentioned, as Olivier Blanchard mentioned, in the low interest rate regime, of course, we can afford to have a public debt. But again, the assumption is that it is for enhancing the public investment or to reduce the output gap. So here the question, especially the emerging countries like India, the question relates to output gap. The way we compute our potential output, it has a lot of econometric issues and also this concept of output gap and the cyclicality. So in these extraordinary times, how can we depend on that idea of output gap and a dependence on the cyclicality when the issues may be something else? This is my question number one to you. Then regarding the fiscal policy instruments, of course, the taxation and expenditure, review and reprioritization, but don't you feel that we have the emphasis on the principle of subsidiarity and the role of intergovernmental fiscal mechanisms, especially in the context of the fiscal federalism? So when we look into that principle of subsidiarity, when we assign the expenditure functions at the lower tiers of government, so what could be that role of intergovernmental fiscal transfers? And my last point is subsidiary to this, that is especially the ecological fiscal transfers, because I know that you have very strong points about incorporating the environmental or climate change concerns in monetary policy, because I am aware of your debate in European, central bank, when Christine Lagarde came up with the idea that climate change can be a part of monetary policy reaction function, but you have quite a bit of strong views against that. But I would like to know your perspectives on the, and we have to take the agenda from the economic growth perspective to growth plus agenda. There, climate change commitments is also equally relevant. So I thought that these are the three quick questions I could answer to. I could ask you. And thank you so much once again for this insightful lecture. Thanks, Fuest.
Thank you. Shall I? Yes. Thank you very, very much for these very important points. Let me start with the first one, the output gap. So yes, the output gap is a concept that plays an important role for fiscal policy, I suppose everywhere, in particular in Europe, also in the context of fiscal supervision. Now, as we all know, and as you said, and I fully agree, it's a problematic concept. It is an estimate, and we know from past experience, even in normal times, that we regularly have to revise the output gap estimates. And sometimes, often we revise the sign because it's very difficult to correctly assess this output gap. It's based on the theory that you can somehow estimate the capacity, the theoretical production potential, and you then compare it to realized output, and it doesn't work very well. Of course, the assumption now is that we have huge output gaps, because we are in a crisis. Now this is tricky because if we shut down the economy, the question is, what does the concept of output gap mean? If the pandemic is still there and we are shutting down parts of the economy, the usual fiscal policy response to output gaps certainly does not work, because if we increase demand in this situation, we can only drive up prices, or we don't find the supply because the output gap isn't really there, but the production potential, if you like, is temporarily reduced. It's interesting, what we see at the moment is rising prices in many areas. Although we are supposedly in a situation where all countries have output gaps, we see, as I'm sure you're aware, rising prices for a lot of intermediate inputs for companies, so that there is a concern about an inflationary push from that side. So in general, I think the output gap as a concept is not totally useless, but it has to be analyzed very carefully. And in this special situation of the COVID crisis, it is particularly problematic if taken as a simple form of fiscal policy guidance. So I agree, one should be skeptical. There are even people in Europe saying we should give this up altogether, the concept of output gap altogether as a guidance for fiscal policy, especially in normal times, because in normal times it's very difficult to determine whether we have positive or negative gaps. Now, how about fiscal federalism? That's a very interesting question. What does the crisis and what does this higher debt level mean for fiscal federalism? It is a question I would have to think about. I think one possible answer would be to say, okay, we need more revenue raising capacities, and if it is correct that central governments have a stronger revenue raising capacity because they do not face the same mobility of taxpayers than local governments, one could say, okay, we need more central level revenue sources. At the same time, if you think about the need to tailor spending to actual needs, maybe it is necessary to have more local spending. If the idea is that the governance here, the accountability is stronger. But I think in general, it's a complex and very relevant question, and I believe a question for economic research to look into. Yeah, then there is this issue. I mean, you're right to point to environmental policy and climate protection. I have emphasized economic growth very much, but I think this is closely linked to the challenge of climate change and protecting biodiversity, which is a major challenge, not only an economic one, but also an economic challenge. And I think that we need to design in this context, and it's in this situation where we are. It is very important to reconcile the protection of the environment with economic growth. And I'm convinced climate protection can become an engine of growth if it is done well. And we as economists would say doing it well means put a lot of emphasis on the CO2 price and make sure that we do not make sure that the overall policy framework is consistent. And I've been skeptical regarding the idea of green monetary policy only insofar as I say, first of all, this is not environmental policy is not the mandate of the ECB. So an independent central bank has to be very aware of its mandate and the limitations of its mandate. And what's lacking is an overall consistency with the CO2 price. So what can green monetary policy improve in a world where we have a uniform CO2 price and something like the European emissions trading system, which determines CO2 emissions? I think that is an important question. Thank you.
So much.
So there's one question in the chat. Maybe I can react to that. Could you please elaborate on features of the forthcoming crisis that you have mentioned in your talk? So this was what I was trying to say was that we currently have a number of forecasts saying that countries will remain at their elevated debt to GDP levels after the crisis. So they will not be able to bring it down. And there is a lot of evidence showing that if you go into a crisis with a very high debt to GDP level, you will be affected more because you have less room to react. And I said, there will be future crises. Unfortunately, I don't know, of course, what that crisis will be. You may remember that after the financial crisis, we all speculated, what will the next crisis be? A lot of people have said we need to make sure that the financial system is more solid to avoid another financial crisis. Now, this time the crisis didn't come from the financial sector. It came through the pandemic. And probably the next crisis will still have another cause. Maybe it will be another financial crisis. Maybe it will be a pandemic or whatever. We don't know. But what we do know is that a country that enters whatever type of severe economic crisis with high debt levels has difficulties stabilizing the economy and will come out of it worse. And that's why good times and the hopefully stable years we have before us need to be employed to bring down public debt levels.
Pinaki, you're muted.
Any other question to Professor Fuest? If there are no other questions, I would like to quickly make a couple of observations in terms of summary, as I understood, of today's lecture, and then we conclude. Thank you very much, Professor Fuest, for this fascinating lecture. And what is a normal debt ratio, the point that you started with your lecture? I think it's the most important question. And you talked about India, and in India, before the corona crisis, we were talking about bringing our debt to GDP ratio to 60%. And one crisis of 1 year, few months, so 16 months crisis induced by the coronavirus has increased our debt ratio to 90% of GDP. And the Finance Commission has proposed in its recommendation that the combined debt, that is debt of the center and the state, should be brought down to 85% by 25-26. So one crisis, 25% increase in the debt to GDP ratio. So naturally, I think it is a cause of concern. The point that you have made about initial condition of debt and deficit matter a lot. And as you have mentioned in your lecture, that like Germany, in India's case, also debt to GDP ratio was coming down, but everything went away because of the crisis. And now we are talking about bringing down the debt to GDP ratio to 85%. Now, other important point, I think that as researcher, for me, this is for us to take forward and do more country-specific evidence-based research, is the issue of, in a declining interest rate, and then there is a decline in growth rate, yet the debt to GDP ratio is going up in many countries. And what are the reasons for that? I think there are a lot of issues in terms of the pressure on the fisc. And one issue that you have highlighted in your lecture is the issue of aging. I think in a country like India, where there is large young population, there is an issue of redistributive spending, whether it is health, whether it is education, whether it is maternal health, nutrition. I think these are becoming very important, and these redistributive expenditures are mostly at the state level. So there are a lot of transfers happening to make sure that these spendings are done by the states. At the same time, we see large deficit in the current accounts because these are all current consumption expenditures. So there is capital asset creation is less, though the fiscal deficit is going up. So that is another story that I see in happening in many country-specific data when we look at. I fully agree with the fact that, and this is quite revealing, there will be huge differential impact of public spending due to the age-related distribution towards older age, more towards the older age population in some of the countries. But challenges will be very different in the countries which are of young age, and their fiscal pressure will come for providing basic services like health, education, roads, access to clean drinking water, sanitation, etc. And does optimal taxation with greater revenue leads to greater progressivity? Yes, it does not. And also I thought it is important for a research institute like ours to also work on the issue of net fiscal benefits, because at the same time, I think there has been a lot of redistributive spending happening to deal with the crisis for livelihood security and things like that. And we really do not know where the money is, what is the redistributive impact of, or the fiscal incidence of this entire government response. And that is where also there is this big discussion about give more money, more demand, more public spending should push growth. I think those debates needs to be, further analyzed and dissected and see what is happening. So I thank you very much, Professor Fuest, for your time and giving us such a fascinating lecture. It was wonderful listening to you. Thank you once again. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for your time, and thanks for the invitation, and have a great conference. Thank you.